Around the 3rd century, Christianity began to introduce a new sexual code focused on the religious concepts of holiness and purity. The emerging church, which gained social and political sway by the mid-3rd century, had two approaches to sexuality. One of these, like their Greco-Roman predecessors, did not view or judge sexuality in terms of heterosexual or homosexual acts. Instead, it only judged the act itself and promoted a sex life that mainly focused on platonic relationships. Some point to the ancient church's brother-making ceremony as an example of same-sex marriage, but this is contested. For instance, the Roman tradition of forming a legal union with another male by declaring a brother persisted during the early medieval years. Also, though there was no official marriage within religious communities, long-lasting relationships or bonds were made. Also, many poems from that century suggest the existence of lesbian relationships. The main approach to Christian sexuality held an opposing view. Under this approach, sex was only meant for procreation purposes. Sexual activity in which procreation was impossible, including homosexual acts, was considered sinful. Such a view was inherited from aspects of late antique pagan ethics and was at first limited to abstinent Christian writers who were deeply inspired by Hellenistic philosophy. Eventually, it would be this approach to sexuality that was favored and spread throughout the Christian world because it limited sexual activity the most and appealed to an already understood principle. Ultimately, this approach would become the standard of Catholic orthodoxy. By the end of the Middle Ages, most of the Catholic churchmen and states accepted and lived with the belief that sexual behavior was, according to natural law aimed at procreation, considering purely sterile sexual acts, oral and anal sex, as well as masturbation, sinful. However, homosexual acts held a special place as crimes against natural law. Most civil law codes had punishments for such unnatural acts, especially in regions that were heavily influenced by the Church's teachings. In the early medieval years, homosexuality was given no particular penance, it was viewed like all the other sins. For example, during the 8th century, Pope Gregory III gave penances of 160 days for unnatural female acts and usually 1 year for males who committed acts of sodomy, the passive partner being treated more severely. During the Inquisition itself, individuals were rarely investigated for sodomy alone. It was usually associated with the expression of heretical beliefs and attacks on the Church. Those who did not recant their heresy would be severely punished. The papal restoration of the 11th century led to increasingly harsher attitudes towards sodomites. The Council of Nablus in 1120, in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, enacted severe penalties for sodomy in the aftermath of the defeat of the Antiochene army at the Field of Blood the year before. In the 13th century, France, sodomy resulted in castration on the first offense, dismemberment on the second, and burning on the third. Lesbian, a term never used in the Middle Ages, was punished with specific mutilations for the first two offenses and burning on the third. By the mid-14th century in many cities in Italy, civil laws against sodomy were common. If a person was found to have committed sodomy, the city's government was entitled to confiscate the offender's property. By 1533, King Henry VIII had enacted the death penalty for sodomy, which became the basis for many anti-sodomy laws to establish the death penalty, the Buggery Act 1533. This also led to the fact that although the Renaissance traced its origins to ancient Greece, none of the literary masters dared to publicly proclaim male's love. In the subject of homosexuality in medieval Europe, art is one of the least studied aspects when researching the matter. As Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, the religion became widespread throughout medieval Europe over the centuries, leading to less secular subjects being produced as more energy was used to convert practitioners of pagan religions. This was also in part because from the early to late Middle Ages most art was produced under the Church, leading art of the time to have more theological themes. Though this was the case, depictions of homosexuality as sodomy did exist, varying in form from region to region, either in forms of damnation by the Church or depictions of love, mainly through manuscripts and literature. Sexuality in the Middle Ages was male-centered and revolved around the idea that a man's penis was required to have fulfilling sexual activity. The lack of attention paid to lesbianism in the Middle Ages can stem from this belief that as long as a dildo or other penis-shaped object was not used in lesbian relationships, then the relationship was not considered fully sexual. Two medical situations were linked to lesbianism in medieval Europe. One such condition was that the womb of a woman had a buildup of her seed, and due to lack of sexual intercourse, this caused the suffocation of the womb. The cure for this suffocation was for a midwife to place hot items on the woman and bring her to orgasm. This would help her to retain the seed of a man. The idea of one woman bringing another woman to orgasm was considered morally wrong by religious leaders, and in the 13th century, it was urged that marriage was a solution for this problem rather than manual stimulation. The second ailment was regalia of the womb, in which fleshy growths grew as a result of intercourse or childbirth, and these growths could sometimes grow on the outside of the vagina. These growths resembled penises, and it was thought that women with these would be able to have heterosexual sex with other women because a penis was needed to have intercourse. Eventually, the practice of masturbating women and the idea that women with the radial would have sex with other women disappeared over time, further masking lesbian activities in medieval Europe. Many writings dealing with lesbianism in medieval Europe come from religious texts. The earliest text that shows the Church's disapproval of lesbianism comes from the writings of St. Paul to the Romans. In his letters, he states, "Women exchanged natural relations for unnatural, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, and receiving in their persons the due penalty for their error." While Paul does not explicitly describe lesbian relations between women, he does state that this is an unholy choice made, and that women who commit these unnatural acts will be punished, presumably by God's will. One of the earliest descriptions of lesbianism details how early church leaders felt about what was described as unnatural relations. The mentality of the church regarding lesbianism was also seen in the rise of penitential. Penitentials were guides used by religious leaders and laypersons in dealing with issues in a broader community. While discussion of dealing with lesbianism was not mentioned in these penitential, it was an overall concept that lesbian relations were a smaller sin than male homosexuality. One such penitential that mentions the consequences of lesbian activity was the Penitential Theodori, attributed to Theodore of Tarsus. 3 main canons are mentioned regarding female homosexuality. If a woman practices vice with a woman, she shall do penance for 3 years. If she practices solitary vice, she shall do penance for the same period. The penance of a widow and a girl is the same. She who has a husband deserves a greater penalty if she commits fornication. According to his canons, Theodore sees lesbian activities as a minor sin, as fornication is considered, rather than a more serious sexual sin like adultery. Unmarried women and girls were judged less severely because they had a single status and did not have another form of sexual release. Married women, who had willing sexual partners in their husbands, were judged more harshly because they sought sexual satisfaction through an unnatural form. Religious figures throughout the 12th and 13th centuries continued to ignore the concept of lesbianism, but St. Thomas Aquinas discusses in his Subject of Lust that female homosexuality falls under one of the 4 categories of unnatural acts. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more videos.